Hey everybody, this is Robot here, scooterwest.com, Vespa Motorsport. What do we got here? Oh, it looks like a 2005 GT200. It's the predecessor to the GTS 250, 300 Super. It's essentially the exact same frame that they use on the very latest 300 right now, but it's their first iteration. It came in a 125 and a 200. The motor, it has a lot of similarities to the 250 and 300. First of all, it's not fuel injected like any of the newer scooters. And the motor is more related to the motor found in the Vespa ET4 and LX. They call it the leader motor. And it's just the basic architecture of the motor. Don't really need to get into how the motor is, but it's a little different than the 250s, 300s. My opinion of these scooters are not quite as durable as the 250s and 300s. They kind of made a lot of improvements on the later ones. But I get a lot of these old timers say, oh, I like carburetors. Carburetors are better. You know, I know how to clean them. You know, anything fuel injected, you gotta have a computer to figure it out. Well, you know, one thing with the carburetor is they get gummed up, and that's what's wrong with this scooter. Customer brought it in a couple of years ago. We cleaned the carburetor. They hardly rode it. This beauty has only got 2,000 miles on it. But guess what? They let it sit again. So back to square one, got to clean the carburetor. Fuel injected stuff, you know, a lot of times you can throw a battery in them even after 2 years and they'll start right up. If you leave it any longer, you might run into some issues, but that's with anything. You're not supposed to let any, I don't know, vehicles, they shouldn't be sitting, they should be used. So I'm gonna just kind of go through the steps to kind of get this scooter out of mothball status, you know, get it back to the running status. So I'm gonna check the battery. I think the customer put a new battery in it because it cranks over fine. And it kind of starts, so you know it's not too bad, but when this is more of a specialty tester. But I'll check the battery real quick. A bunch of steps. It's like playing a little video game on something from the 80s. Good battery, so looks like the battery's fine. Charge is good, 12.98 volts. So I suspect the customer has put a brand new battery in this and they realize, well, it's not really rideable. One thing I noticed firsthand is that terminal's a little corroded. I'll probably go back and sand that terminal with a wire wheel or a little wire brush or a file, just kind of clean it up. You know, that's one issue I found with all the Vespas. They have a lot of vibration, so these terminals will come loose. I get scooters come in just like that. See, I just touched it, came loose. You know, that's what happens when you have it loose. You know, and the vibration would make that, and you'd be wondering why it's not starting so well, or not starting at all, or cutting out, or whatever. So that's one thing to look out for. So I don't need to put a battery in it, but I do need to address the terminals on this. And again, on any of the GT, GT200, 250, GT 125, Super, Primavera, Sprint, it's always 4 screws and you got the battery cover right there. One thing with any of these older GT200s is, you know, a lot of these hoses, you got to consider this scooter is over 10 years old at this point. You know, it says manufactured very early 2006. You know, so sometimes you'll end up with issues with the manifold cracking. So you want to check the manifold, check all these hoses. This example looks really good. And since I've serviced this bike in the past, I've already replaced the fuel line. You can see the fuel line goes to the carburetor right there. I don't know if Scott's got that in the camera. It comes around this little hoop right here, and there's the fuel filter right there. And it's what a lot of the early ones, the fuel lines would start leaking. Not only at this fuel filter one, but there's also another short fuel line that's a big problem on this model scooter. And I'll show you that part, you know, when we're on the right side of the scooter. But a lot of times, maybe before you're going to jump in this job, it'd be a good idea to have the new fuel lines and fuel filters. And fortunately, we got a whole kit that has the fuel line. Right, Scott can put this in the description, but that's, you know, I have my guys, they pre-cut the fuel line. This is like a Tygon fuel line. It holds up. It's a little more supple than the original stuff. It has the built-in fuel filter. It's already cut the length. I don't know what this runs. I think it's part number GTFUEL -Tygon or -TY, something like that. We also have a cheaper version. It just has a regular reinforced rubber lines, but this one tends to last a little longer. For the short fuel line, you're going to need a quarter inch fuel line, and you'll need only like 2 or 3 inches. And you can order the fuel line by the foot here. So if you order a foot of fuel line, you'll be able to fix the other problematic fuel leak that arises on these GT200s. And if you're not too familiar with what's in here, I kind of jumped the gun, started talking about the hoses. But you got the carburetor. That's kind of what meters the fuel. There's a couple parts on here that, you know, before I even take it apart, kind of show you what's going on with the carburetor here. Carburetor is very similar to the one found on the Vespa LX and the ET4s. Some of the other carbureted Vespas, Vespa S150 is carbureted. There's a lot of Piaggio products that were carbureted as well with similar motor designs to these Vespas. Here you got the automatic choke. It's not necessarily a choke. It actually, when it's cold, it opens up an extra bypass that allows extra fuel to be metered, extra air and fuel to be metered from the air filter to the intake, so the scooter starts. And in there is a positive temperature coefficient, like thermistor. Don't need to really explain what it does, but essentially it gets hot when the electricity starts flowing, you know, once the scooter's running, and it closes up that passage, you know, over a set time. And, you know, it's been engineered to close at different rates based on what the ambient temperature of this little device is. I see, you know, through the mail order, I see a lot of people ordering these. Here in the retail or whatever, the service department, I don't really replace too many of them. I think a lot of customers damage them, or they just think, well, it's an electric part, it needs to be replaced, or suspect they're running issues are related to this. But I'll tell you, they're quite reliable. And you know, one thing you could kind of see if it's working, you know, once the scooter's running, you could put your finger on it and you'll feel some heat coming off the top of this little mechanism here. And this little cover comes off. I mean, if you shift it off to the side, you'll be able to get the cover off, kind of insulate some of the heat to keep it in the device or whatever. On the center thing that's held by 4 screws, this is a diaphragm. They call these a constant velocity carburetor. So a diaphragm goes up and down based on the engine load, not necessarily the throttle opening. And what that does is there's a needle, a metering needle on the end of that. And when we have the carburetor part, I'll show you that metering needle. And it changes height based on how much load is on the engine. And oftentimes you'll have issues where either the slide will be worn out. Sometimes on GT200s, the slide will actually break, their aluminum slide. The rubber diaphragm will deteriorate. A lot of issues. I'll show you how to test for that. You got the throttle pulley right there. So I'm twisting the throttle. And over here you can see this little linkage. So every time you open the throttle, it squirts a little gas. That's called the accelerator pump. So when you tip into the throttle, basically when you roll onto the throttle, what the issue is you don't have enough velocity of air going through the carburetor to draw the fuel across the jets. So this will supplement the carburation with extra fuel in transient throttle. So basically when you tip on the throttle, wick on the, get on the gas, it will give a little extra squirt of gasoline. When we get the bowl apart, there's essentially a float in there. If you had any other carburetor part, most motorcycle carburetors all use a float. If you ever taken the lid off a back of a toilet, a regular toilet, it works exactly the same way. It just keeps a constant level of fuel while in a toilet. When you flush the toilet, the float allows water to rush into the bowl to bring it up to the specified or set level. Works exactly the same way. Sometimes you need to replace the needle that meters that fuel that goes into the float bowl or whatever you want to call it. Some of the other parts of the carburetor, you're going to have 3 jets on a carburetor like this. There's the main jet, which is pretty much all the fueling that's you know, above, I don't know, eighth throttle or quarter throttle, there's an idle jet or a slow jet. And that meters the fuel when the throttle's closed and just off idle, you know, or just when you're getting on the gas or very small throttle openings. It does a lot of the fueling there. And then last, the choke, there's a, not a choke jet. I keep on calling it a choke. It's not necessarily called a choke on this type of scooter, but it's the cold start enriching jet. I don't know. There's a lot of like technical names for it. A lot of times people just call it the choke jet. It's not really a choke, but it's a jet that only comes in play when the motor is cool and warming up. I'll kind of show you what this scooter does. You know, right now it's cold and it will kind of start. And this is pretty typical of a scooter that hasn't sat too long, is it will want to start, but it will die out once it gets a little bit warm. So the reason it did that is I was opening the throttle a bunch of times, and the accelerator pump, since it's kind of a pressurized circuit, every time I was wicking the throttle, it was pumping a little bit of gasoline into the intake. So it's not going to stay running because the choke passage or the cold start enriching jet is clogged, and I'm absolutely sure the idle jet is clogged. Sometimes you get a scooter that will start and, you know, kind of idle for about 30 seconds and then die out. That means most likely your choke passage is all okay. It's your idle passage that's clogged up. And that's the most likely, because that's one of the smallest passages in the whole entire carburetor. That's probably enough of me talking about it. Let's jump into tearing it all apart. All right, kind of jumped the gun with pulling the carburetor. One thing I do with every scooter, say anybody tells me, oh, my scooter's been sitting 6 months, I haven't used it. One thing you want to rule out is just drain off the gas and put fresh gas in it. Nowadays, here in California, they add 10% ethanol. The ethanol kind of dries up and plays havoc on the carburetors and all the hoses and everything else that's in the fuel system. So, you know, gas is pretty inexpensive considering, you know, what's the most you're going to put in one of these scooters, like 2 gallons. So instead of pulling your hair out and like cleaning the carburetor out and still wondering why the thing doesn't start too well and has some issues, just jump with flushing out the gas. So sometimes maybe it'll get the thing running just by flushing out the gas. The one problem is, much like a toilet, there's still water in the float, you know, and the only way to flush that old fuel out is there's a screw on the very bottom of the bowl, and you'll see that when I get the carburetor out. So sometimes you can get away with just putting fresh gas through it and getting it going. I know there's like lots of like mystery whatever, cleaner, whatever, I don't know, snake oil as far as I'm concerned, that people always tell me, oh, I poured all this like magic stuff into the tank. It doesn't do anything. You know, I know there's some stuff that kind of stabilizes the ethanol in it, but the bottom line is if you got an idle jet clogged, there's nothing that's gonna just physically poke that obstruction of the gunked up fuel out of that idle jet. You're just gonna physically go in there and clean it out. There's no magic potion that's gonna rinse that out. You know, there's some stuff that will kind of wash away the residue, but it doesn't do any good if it's clogged up. So I don't know, just stay away from that stuff. I've had people mix all sorts of magic potions in their gas tank, and I don't know, a couple months ago we had one that, I don't know what they added, but the fuel that was in the tank was just horrendous smelling. I mean, it just, everything that fuel touched, it just smelled horrible. I don't even know how to explain the smell. It was just a weird smell. It was, the customer claimed they added some additive to the fuel, and it was pretty bad. Drain the gas out. You can go anything from a simple hose. This thing's called like a jiggle siphon. I've had this one forever. I think some like door-to-door salesman guy like selling tools. It wasn't even a tool truck dude, just came by the shop. This is like the 30th Street days, like 10 years ago, whatever. And I don't know, he's selling for like 10 bucks. And I thought, oh, this is cool. And then you go to like Harbor Freight or, I don't know, all sorts of places to sell it. It's got like this brass thing, there's like a marble in there. And usually this is what I try first. There's like 2 other ways I get a siphon going. And I'll tell you, one of them isn't putting my mouth on the end of the hose and sucking. Although that will work, I don't want a mouth full of gasoline. One thing with these GT gas tanks, or pretty much any of the Vespa gas tanks, they're pretty odd shape. It kind of goes from back here, snakes all the way around here. The lowest point of the fuel tank's about right there. So the hose has got to kind of snake down there. So I got like an empty metal fuel tank right here, and I'll kind of show you. If the tank's full enough, it will. You give it a shake, and it just starts to siphon. It's kind of like a one-way check valve when you shake it. A couple other ways to go about getting a siphon going. You can carefully pressurize the tank to get a siphon going. Yeah, I suspect there's more gas than that in here, but I have the thing kind of low. I'll kind of show some of the other ways while we're at it. So get the tank up here, make sure I don't spill it. You don't want to pressurize the tank with like a ton of pressure, just kind of, you know, cup it off. This is compressed air off, you know, not everybody has this set up, but. So the pressure does a trick. Maybe there isn't much gas in this. Thing's all the way in. It sounds pretty empty in there. Bet you if I turn the gauge on, it's pretty low. Another way that's a little messier is you can get a venturi going just by. And there's not enough gas in there, but I don't know. One of the other techs likes doing this. I don't know, it's not really worth it. I like pressurizing the tank or shaking the jiggler and getting it going. And when you pressurize a tank, you don't necessarily need a jiggler. You can just put whatever, you know, an old piece of a garden hose would work. But I suspect that's enough gas in there. You know, I wouldn't be worried if there's still like an eighth of a tank or even a quarter of a tank if you're gonna top it off with fresh gas. I would be worried if the gas is like 5 years old. You may want to remove the tank and check it out a little further because there might be just all sorts of varnishy gum in the bottom of the tank. But I don't suspect that's the case, you know, based on the service history that I know about this scooter that's in our system. All right, now I'm going to jump into pulling the carburetor. All right, so you just need some basic tools to pull the carburetor out of, you know, any of these carbureted modern Vespas, whether it's an LX, ET4, GT200. Got a Phillips. Number 2, got some flat blade screwdrivers. It's a nut that holds this one wire thing, 8mm. If it's still got the original hose clamps, they have like a stainless steel band style hose clamp. You're gonna need a large diagonal plier to cut that band off. I got some needle nose. I got angled ones, but straight ones will work just as well. I tend to like to use these clips. They work very well. The only thing with these kind of clips is you need a special tool to install them. And it's what they look like is just regular pliers, but they have a slot and a little hole in it. So you know, you can squeeze it, and once the hose is on the barb, you can squeeze it, open up, and then the spring tension tightens the clamp. There's other types of hose clamps out there, the worm gear ones. The problem with those is a lot of the hoses on these Vespas are too small. Like the fuel lines and the vacuum lines, all that stuff, they're too small to be using a regular worm gear hose clamp. That's, you know, everybody's kind of familiar with, that's wrenched on anything. You find them at Home Depot, like a you know, hardware store, auto parts store. This is a more of a professional grade type of clamp. If you don't have pliers like this, Clean Tools one or whatever, I have a couple other ones. It's a little tricky, but you can carefully do it with needle nose just as well. See the barb? I gotta work at it a little bit more, but it works just as well if you're in a pinch and don't have the special tool. So this is kind of showing that if you're gonna use our fuel line, kind of with the simple hose clamps on it. Not everybody's gonna have these. These are for pinching hoses off. One thing with the GT200, if you're not familiar with a lot of motorcycles, they heat the carburetor, so it prevents it from icing and it keeps a more constant vaporization of the fuel. So they'll heat the carburetor. They have 2 coolant lines going through the carburetor on these GT200s. A lot of the other carburetors, like found on the LXs and ET4s, they have a heater that threads into the side of the carburetor and works pretty much identical to the choke, where when the temperature is really cold, the heater will kick in, but as things warm up, the resistance goes high on the heater and it no longer heats the carburetor. To be honest with you, in California kind of climate, it's not really something that's needed, but it's there to kind of keep the emissions low, or if you are riding in much colder climates, it can be useful. If you're riding in very cold climates with high humidity, you have the chance of icing a carburetor, which is bad news in like a piston-driven airplane. You know, it's like, what happens is you have the high humidity and the vapor pressure of the high humidity air going through the carburetor at the high velocity will start to freeze up and cause ice around the throttle. Is what happens is you'll end up with a stuck throttle because the ice is actually holding your throttle open. It would be, you know, in a case where you're holding it wide open for a long period of time on a very cold, humid day. You know, I've never heard of anybody having that issue on a Vespa, but it is a possibility, and that's why it's there, why they heat the carburetor. So kind of a little interesting insight in why they have coolant going through the carburetor. But you know, there's another way you could take the little clamp thing, or just let the coolant leak out and replenish it. It's another way if you don't have tools like this. I got to disconnect the throttle cable. I got a little set of wrenches. I think it's a 9mm. That's pretty much it. Just basic tools will get the carburetor out. Got the intake of the intake manifold on the front of the engine. Like I said, I checked it for cracks. You know, that's something that's kind of common on high miles, or not even high miles, just older scooters. It's a rubber part. I went ahead and loosened that band, and you want to loosen it quite a bit. I don't want to loosen it so much that the band disconnects. It's still staying as a ring. If you unscrew it all the way, the band will kind of fall apart. Got that one loose, and then you got this intake snorkel that goes to the air filter. I've seen some people completely loosen the air filter snorkel or take the air box off. It's not really necessary. This clamp's a little different on this. I mean, some of the other models just have a clamp like that, but this one's got this little funky clamp that's got like a little turnbuckle, so you can release it. I'll just keep the clamp down there out of the way. All this stuff, even though it's older in age, is still flexible enough to just pull the carburetor past it. Not really an issue there, you know. Underneath here, you're going to see the coolant lines, and there's another one under here. Got to be careful when we're pulling the carburetor out. There's one other line that's almost always has been disconnected. It's either fallen off or rotted off. For operation of the scooter, it's not critical, but it goes to this this vent port, and that's the vent for the float. And on any of the American bike, any bike sold in America, it's going to have the California emission system, which is a charcoal canister that captures the vapors from the fuel tank. This line also captures the vapors that come off the carburetor. Like I said, the scooter runs perfectly fine without it. You can see it's disconnected. It won't even plug onto that. The hose they use is so crap. Check that out. It just like splits. So I don't know. It's up to you. I mean, if you really care about it, or for some reason you got to have some type of emissions testing, you may want to have it hooked up. But it can just stay vented, or you can cap that off. You'll find that on the LXs. They'll have a similar hose that kind of comes from the back that goes to that vent. But that can be just left open. And I'll just leave that hose alone, because I'm sure the scooter was running fine just the way it is. Not really an issue. Fuel line, we'll disconnect that. We'll leave all the other lines alone. You want to get two hands in there and pull the carburetor away from the intake. You can see the hoses under here for the coolant. And I'm going to use my little clamps because I don't really want to lose coolant, have a mess all over my workbench here. So I'm just going to clamp off those two hoses. The other hose goes all the way around the other side. I will gain access to it, but that's kind of what holds up the carburetor. You can't really pull it off too easy. This is where probably a straight needle nose would work a little bit better. I don't know if Scott's get in there. The hands are kind of in the way, but these have a wire type clamp that's got like a double wire, and I pulled it away. The barb goes about a 1/2 inch or whatever, 12 millimeters in. And now that both hoses are crimped off, you can carefully lever the line off it. And you saw I levered it off from the front. A lot of times if you pull a line, it's like kind of like a Chinese finger trap. The more you pull, the more the hose will want to tighten onto the barb. So the best way to get a hose off is get under it and pull it. And it causes the hose to expand ever so slightly. There's special tools that will get under hoses, especially really stubborn coolant hoses. You see it didn't drip any coolant, you know, just from that. The boot is still connected right here. And I'll just get something under there. This is a nice round tool. And you can kind of work that lip right off it. And it comes right off. You know, like I said, you don't need to take the whole air box apart. And the last hose, it's a little more stubborn there. Not the last hose, but the other coolant hose is right there. And I'm gonna get to that, work the clamp off. You know, I'll show you another way that you could get these off. This screw right here holds this little elbow that has the coolant going through it. You could just unscrew that screw. Unfortunately, that thing is usually too tight to really remove with a hand screwdriver, so it doesn't really work all that well. So again, kind of start from the beginning and see the hose comes right off. It only dripped a little bit of coolant. This hose on the bottom here is your carburetor vent or drain. And like I suggested in the first step, you can gain access from the left-hand side of the panel to this little flat-bladed screwdriver, and that allows you to drain the remaining fuel out of the carburetor. And typically you want to do that, say if you were going to mothball your scooter and not use it for the winter, the best thing would be to siphon the gas out and drain the carburetor using this screw until no more fuel drains out of it, and disconnect the battery and wheel the scooter away. And your likelihood of the scooter running is a lot higher because you've drained all the carburetor, you know, all the fuel out of the carburetor bowl. There's a little piece of that crappy hose. Don't really care about that stuff. So all I got connected is the fuel line. I got the electrical for the choke mechanism, or is more of an auto bi-starter, as I suggested. Talking about, I pop that little cover off. Oftentimes I don't want to deal with disconnecting the electrical connection. That's always usually, or it's typically under this vinyl tubing. A lot of times people lose that tubing. Kind of keeps the connection nice and clean. And you want to have a really good screwdriver, number 2 screwdriver, because a lot of these carburetor screws are quite tight. And another good idea is to have a magnetized tip. I don't even know if mine's magnetized, but I put my finger on it. That's the little grub screw that holds the choke. Pull that out. You can see the needle's got like a little discoloration on the tip. And that's some of the fuel varnish that's a deposit on the needle. And we'll clean that off with a rag. But I'll put that to the side. I'm not going to really mess with that. It's good not to get that part immersed with lots of gasoline or whatever, carburetor cleaner, whatever we're going to use. At one point I did replace the fuel line on this, so you can see it's got a more of the wire style hose clamp on there, and sometimes you can get under there, and I'm just pulling on it, and I'm using the screwdriver to kind of lever the hose off. You can get the needle nose under there. And since the fuel tap and the fuel pump are sealing up, it's not dripping any fuel. If it was dripping fuel, you probably got more issues. That's one thing to keep in mind. GT200s and all the later LXs, they all have fuel pumps on them. Some early LXs, ET4s, they had a gravity feed and just the fuel tap. And what the fuel tap does, just shuts the fuel off when the engine's not running. That's an 8mm or 9mm. Some are 8s, some are 9s, some are 10s. This is an oddball 9mm one. Just spun the little lock nut off, pulling the throttle cable off, unhooking it, and voila, the carburetor is freed from the scooter. One thing to keep in mind is the bowl of the carburetor still has fuel in it, and out of that vent hose, you can let it drain out. Another option is just open the screw on the bottom of the carburetor. Let that drain out. You don't want to tip it all the way over because the gas will go into this vacuum chamber, which isn't a good thing. And my guess is this is just kind of clogged jets. It's not gonna have a bowl that's fully full of varnish. I wish I had a really dirty carb. They aren't pretty. Sometimes you get, most of the time with a new fuel, it ends up being a green mess. It's like green goo in there. Older fuel, it's kind of like a brown fuel, or not brown fuel. It's like a brown gooey mess in the bottom of the carburetor. We'll see what kind of surprises we get. All right, so ready for surgery on the carburetor here. You see the external appearance of this carb is really clean. Like I suggested, we completely cleaned this carburetor, whatever it was, 2 years ago. Customer never used it, so it was really clean, and it's low miles. A lot of times the carburetor would be just all gunky. You may want to clean the whole carburetor off, or even before you pull the carburetor off, I would suggest like get under there with some soapy water and a pressure washer or a hose, and just wash as much debris so you don't end up with really dirty hands, you know, when you're taking, because the worst thing is you have all this dirt on the outside of the carburetor going inside the carburetor. Well, it's not going to work all that well. Before I even take it apart, there's still a small amount of fuel in it. You can see on this end, it opens a butterfly, and on this end is this vacuum operated slide. And one thing to see is I can't even move that slide up because the fuel varnish is completely stuck that slide. There it is. I finally got past the resistance of the varnish in there and opened it up. Don't want to ever stick a screwdriver in there and pry that open because you kind of distort the slide surface or damage it. We'll take that further apart and clean it a little bit, but I did free that up. It was definitely stuck there. And let me show you something how the accelerator pump works. And Scott can focus on here. You might be able to see it. Every time you wick the throttle open, see that little, I don't know, it's like a super fine spurt of gas? That's the accelerator pump working. And I find with carburetors that have been sitting, that's why the scooter started for like the 2 seconds, because it's running off that fuel that's squirting down the throttle slide. All the other parts of the carburetor are too gummed up to allow fuel to go through. This is kind of showing you how that works. And you definitely want to check the operation of all this stuff. A couple things, ooh, getting a whiff of that bad gas smell. This is the vent for the vacuum diaphragm. There's a little teeny filter in there. Don't necessarily need to clean it, but make sure it's there. A lot of times they're missing or dirty. You can just make a new little filter out of an open cell foam. It's not really available as a separate part. Most of the fuel's out. Let's get the screws all broken free. And I tend to like to want to break all the screws free before I have the whole carburetor apart. And I'm putting a lot of pressure down on the screws to crack them free. You can use an electric tool, but I tend not to want to use that. Make sure you don't stab yourself. These ones are especially tight, and they're quite a unique screw. So just break all those free. I'm going to take this apart, even though I don't think I need to. This is the holder for the auto starting mechanism. And this side is is what this little device is. It's only found on some carburetors. I'll take it all the way off. Some carburetors have it, some don't. These GT200 carbs have it, and you can see I was kind of having my finger because there's a spring under there. And whenever you back off the throttle, like say you're decelerating, you're going down a hill, the RPMs of the engine is high, you're just coasting down a hill. The problem with these carburetors is they run very lean, and the very lean running causes misfires or backfires in the exhaust, and you hear little crackles coming out the exhaust. So this little valve, when you're coasting down a hill, it measures whenever there's excessive vacuum on the manifold side of the carburetor. There's a port that's all the way drilled through, and it artificially enriches the idle mixture just a little bit, so you don't end up with the backfires, and you're closer to a stoichiometric running, you know, fuel mixture. I'm not going to explain about how that works, but it's this little teeny diaphragm, a little pin, and a spring. I have a clean surface right here on this aluminum table. Nothing you really need to clean in here. There's not really any issues with it. I just took it apart to show you. You don't want to get this diaphragm soaked with this carburetor cleaner. So it may be a good idea if you're completely dousing this carburetor with cleaner to get any of these rubber parts such as that out of there. I'm going to take the bowl off next. Nice and easy, 4 screws. Some of the parts we have available for, like, if any of these Vespa carbs, you can get the jets are replaceable, the float needles replaceable. You can get a set of gaskets for the carburetor. Generally, I find the gaskets hold up pretty good on these KEIHIN carburetors. You can replace the rubber diaphragm that's in here and the electric choke that I suggested. You know, a lot of people replace unnecessarily. So you can see a little bit of yellow residue in there. And that's the fuel evaporating away and leaving behind deposits that would clog the jets. And you can see I rub them right off. This one's, I don't know, it's not too dirty. I'll tell you, ones that are really dirty, they're a gooey mess, and they take a lot more than just a simple cleaning. I'm going to dump the rest of the fuel off. So in here, you got a couple things going on. You've got the main jet, which you need. You can take the main jet out alone with a flat blade screwdriver, or you can remove the whole stack with a 7mm wrench. So I'm going to remove the whole thing. And this is the least likely jet to be clogged because it's they call it the main jet, so it's the largest passage. So you can see the light going through the passage, and you see a perfectly round hole. That's a good thing. You know, that just shows you that the main jet's not too clogged. You can see that there's this varnish stuff all over this. That's not good. You want to get rid of all that stuff before we put it back together. The next important jet is the idle jet. And it's this one in the center cavity right here. A lot of times, if this jet's really clogged, I just replace it. It's pretty inexpensive. So that's your idle jet, and it's gonna have the hole on that is 35/100ths of a millimeter, so about 1/3 of a millimeter, which is bigger than a hair, but smaller than, like, I don't know, a small piece of wire. Something like that. Oftentimes you don't really need to mess with the float. I know there was no issues with this carburetor because I cranked it quite a bit off camera and to see if I can get it running. And if there's some issue with this float, it would have been, if the needle was grungy, it would have been flooding over. To get the float needle out, this is a press fit in here. It's not going to want to come out. You're going to need a really small punch, which is like a hardened pin. You need to dry that needle out. But I'll tell you, a lot of times this is best. If this hasn't been messed with and it works, just leave it alone, you know. And you can see the float level is perfect. I'm just tipping it right where you see the float stops, not all the way like that. That's not how you measure a float. So I tip it to right where it is, and see that line on the float, like the seam line of when they mold the float together. That's perfectly parallel with this this surface. I know it's about 2 millimeters above, but it's parallel. That float level is perfect. I don't need to mess with it. If you did need to mess with it, this little metal tang can be bent back or forth to make adjustments. I'm not going to mess with it because a lot of times messing with that ends up causing more troubles when you don't need to be messing around with it. Normally it's not necessary to take this off, but I'll just show you there's a gasket under here. Larger screws. Again, you want to do this on a really clean work surface. You know, don't work on like those red shop towels. Those have a lot of fibers in them, and they'll end up clogging the carburetor. Little gasket in there. There's not really ever any issues with that gasket. We can spray the carburetor cleaner through all those passages. This right here is your idle mixture adjustment screw. As you can see, it's not a normal flat bladed screwdriver. They do a special D-shaped brass screw in there. They keep people from tampering with it for emissions reason, I guess. We sell a tool that's pretty similar to this. Actually, one we sell is made out of steel and it's a little bit stronger. This is just one I happen to have in my toolbox. And it's got like a D-shaped, a rounded D-shaped end. And sometimes if you're not familiar with this, you could count how many turns, you know, in quarter turns, how many it's in. So half, 1, half, 2, 2 1/4. So it's 2 1/4 in, that's pretty typical. I'm gonna go ahead and just back it all the way out. And if you're watching, I was just counting how many turns, you know, in, because that's the set point. You bottom out the screw, bottom out the needle, the mixture needle on this, and then you back it off, and that's usually how these are measured. And that's a pretty typical measurement, is 2 1/4, 2 1/2. And typically you don't want to go more than 3. There's not any reason to go less than 1 1/2 on this style carburetor. So you see the needle, that little tip meters the fuel at idle, along with the idle jet. And they call this a fuel screw. Some carburetors, they have an air screw. It works the opposite. It meters extra air past the whole carburetor. This is the opposite. It meters extra fuel. In here there's a little O-ring and a washer. We need to get those out. They never want to fall out on their own. So I took a stiff piece of wire. A paper clip will work just as well. I bent a little J-hook on it. And then I'm going to cut it so it's just a real small little J. And the whole idea of that is it's kind of like making a fishing lure. And you can go in there. And to be honest with you, I think a paper clip works better than this, because I have a paper clip sitting around somewhere. I don't even clean carburetors that much. I usually have the other techs do it. But and they've all seen this technique where you can fish out 2 parts that are in there. And we sell that separate little O-ring and that washer. They don't really want to separate. Those are 2 parts of the mixture. So the mixture screw goes like this. It goes spring. Somebody's bumping some tunes outside. And then the little O-ring. But I'm going to clean that a little bit. That's it. You're never going to be able to tap that out, unfortunately. I'm going to take the top of the carburetor off. You can see these funky step screws. I think we sell those. They're really, really expensive screws, so it's just your best bet is not to lose them. So I'm keeping my finger, well, I'm kind of screwing up. I'm already. Because there's going to be a spring in there that's going to want to release. Not doing it with this with the best techniques, but that opens. You got this spring in here and this mixture needle retainer. And there should be a needle that's going to fall out. There it is. And that needle has some residue. I'll show you that we need to clean off. Remember I showed you that thing was sticking in there? And this is also something that's really important to check. You can see this varnish that's on here. That's what's causing it to stick. I'm going to just wipe it off with this rag and it should be fine. Oops, don't drop it though. You want to look at this all the way around. Make sure there's no tears in it or any kinds of cracks. If there's anything wrong with it, you got to just start fresh with this slide. Common problem, you can see some of the metal wear on this. I've seen ones where whole entire chunks have been missing and they go down the carburetor and the scooter's not running right, you know, on a normal running scooter. And I'll find a chunk of this missing. It's kind of a common problem on the GT200s that they'll lose part of the slide. This slide looks like it's still in serviceable condition, just needs a little bit of cleaning. So that's pretty much as far as you need to take the carburetor body apart. Yeah, like I said, I'm not going to mess with that. I have carbon choke cleaner. Actually jumped the gun. There's one more part in there that you could poke out very carefully with a screwdriver. That's the needle jet holder. All right, so I'm going to go to town and clean all these passages. You know, Like I said, this one's not too dirty, but you can see there's like some yellow juices coming out of it. And there's all these little passages, you know, this is why you want to wear safety glasses. You can see these air jets, as they call them. They all need to be sprayed out. We know the accelerator pump was working fine, but all these, the choke jet is the one that's built in, and sometimes it's clogged, and you'll need to use a piece of wire that I'll show you the next step. I want to make sure that's clean. You can spray a little bit through the needle. It's not going to hurt the needle. There's all your choke passages. And you'll see that they connect. See how that's spraying a really nice stream of carb spray? That means that passage is clear right there. So that's a good thing. That's about as much as I need to clean. You can give all these. And I think that's as clean as I need to get this carburetor, the carburetor body, that is. For more extreme cases, say I had the really green carburetor, I would, you know, take the needle out. I'd clean the needle, take the needle and the float and all that stuff all apart by using a small punch like this and a small ball peen hammer to drive that pin through. And I'd take this whole entire body. This isn't something like a home mechanic's going to have, but it's an ultrasonic cleaner. And what it does is it has a, like an alkaline cleaning solution in there. It heats up to about 80 Celsius, quite hot, and you can probably hear it when it turns on. This carburetor is definitely not dirty enough, but you don't want to stick your finger in there. The ultrasonic waves kind of messes with your hands, but this is what we use at the shop. I have a lot of people mail us carburetor bodies that are really, really dirty, and I think for 40 bucks, I'll ultrasonic clean them for about a half hour. If you want to rebuild the whole carburetor, it's going to cost a little bit extra, because you can see it's pretty in-depth to go through one of these carburetors. A lot of times I'll let some of this soak in there. You want to take care not to get carburetor spray on that gasket right there. This doesn't really need much cleaning. And these parts are all going to be, you know, these are all the parts that meter the fuel. They're all going to need some sort of cleaning, including that. So take a small piece of the rag. This, you don't want to get any of the carb spray on that rubber diaphragm, but I just want to wipe all this varnishy buildup off this slide. And that's as far as you want to clean that. Same with this needle here. Just wipe it off. This needle, you see that little ridge? You want to wipe it clean so that ridge no longer exists. And these blue paper towels are the best solution, because you're not going to leave any fibers like you would with a cotton towel. So now that's clean. You can clean all these parts, you know, all the varnish kind of buildup that's on all these parts. Next step is we want to clean out the jets themselves. And I can't, you know, I could usually shine a flashlight like we showed with the main jet. I can't even see any light flashing through this idle jet. And that's your most common jet that will clog, is that little guy right there. I found the best way to clean these jets is you can either use like a welding torch cleaner, or just take a piece of stranded wire, strip like a good section of it. Nice thing about copper is it's softer than brass, so there's no chance of damaging these jets. And you get multiple tries because you got so many filaments. But it doesn't take much to push through that little bit of resin. I can see the resin right on the end. And what I'm doing is I'm kind of rotating the jet back and forth on there to kind of clean the orifice. Because one thing is the sides in there, if they still have gunk on it, it's still going to be running lean and not meter the fuel. And now with gloves on, I'll kind of pinch the jet off. See how it's like doing the nice stream? It's exactly what you want to see. So that jet, I don't need to look down it, but I know it's clear. The main jet, you can put like a couple filaments down it because it's so much bigger. This is your best way to do it. You know, it's like there's other tools that they sell for cleaning jets out. You use drills, and I see it pushed out some kind of some nasty stuff, and just clean it out. And like I said, the copper's not going to hurt the jet. You can fold this over, stick it down here, use it to ream all the resin that's in there out, or whatever you want to call it. I don't know. Varnish buildup, excuse me. One other thing with this main jet, there's 6 other little holes. Make sure they're all spraying. If any of those are clogged, you could do the same thing. Poke all these like little guys out. Yeah, you got to clean all this stuff, because I see all these people do like, yeah, I don't know, these half-assed kind of cleanings. Don't know what they're doing. And they wonder why they spend all that time, put it back together, it's still not running right. Just do it right, make sure everything's all cleaned out. And this is with any carburetor, you know, I was like, yeah. And if the carburetor is completely trashed with all sorts of gooey stuff, or this is torn, it's just in horrible shape, might be just better off buying a whole carburetor. I got the carburetor juice soaking in there. I'm just using a little piece of wire. And what you could do is loosen up all that stuff. And you could check the operation of that the accelerator pump too. I'm squirting the card spray through. So again, the copper wire works good to kind of scratch up the gooey varnish in there. I don't know, not being very proper by throwing it off to the side, but whatever evaporates. Again, you could use a knot, like a paper towel in there to wipe it out. Sometimes, you know, you spend all this time cleaning it and you still won't quite get it perfectly clean. You know, the only way you'll do it is with the ultrasonic cleaner. And again, make sure the gasket's staying in space. If you soak that gasket with too much carburetor spray, it's going to expand the size of it and will never go back into shape. Never want to put silicone sealant on this. I've seen that. That's a big no-no. It just immediately clogs up your jets. You put a little grease on there, and that's about the most you want to do with that. But pretty much all these parts are clean enough. I'm going to go ahead and wipe the needle that's on that auto bi starter, or the choke mechanism, that electric part. We'll wipe that off. Got the needle holder. Losing parts here. I see this, people try to put this in upside down a lot. It's not going to do you any good. Kind of pay attention to the way it goes, falls out. The longer part of it drops in this larger of the 2 holes. I'm going to get the main jet in, thread that in. You could, if you just want to take only the main jet out, you could, the flat blade screwdriver would do the trick. Got your idle jets all freshly cleaned. Use a flat blade screwdriver. Fits the jet quite well. You know, you don't want to use a Mickey Mouse screwdriver that ends up slipping and damaging the jet. I've seen broken jets before and can't really retrieve them. Nothing else goes in there. I'm fairly confident there's no issues with the float. You can always test the float by hooking up a temporary gas supply to it and filling it up. And one thing is you make sure the linkage is all correct. See the linkage for the thing, you kind of got to slip it underneath this pulley right here. So I'm kind of holding the bowl together. One thing is if you buy the gasket kit, there's an O-ring on that screw in there for draining the gas out of the carburetor bowl, but I'm not messing with that. So you see I just snugged them all just by spinning the screwdriver first and then going back and forth in diagonal pattern to kind of tighten it. And I can tell just the way these screws are tightened that gasket's still good. It's kind of compressing the rubber gasket, and that's a good thing. So want to make sure these are all tight. Don't slip and stab your fingers or whatever. We're going to put this little guy back together. See that O-ring? It does pick off. You could put it in here. If you want to put a little grease to hold it in place, you could do that as well. Don't really need to. Now we're going to put that the mixture needle in. It goes right in that little orifice. So spring. Hopefully I'm not going so fast that Scott can't focus on everything. The little washer and that little teeny O-ring. Again, that washer, O-ring, you can buy those as spare parts because they're easily lost. So the cool thing, once the O-ring's on there, it kind of doesn't want to fall off the needle. Drop that right in there. And is what you do is go all the way in. And I measured out 2 1/4 turns. That's pretty ideal for a good running GT200. And you get half, 1, half, 2 1/4. There you go. Put this guy back in. One thing is this only goes in one direction, and that's with all of them. There are some carburetors it is possible to put in the wrong direction. I'm kind of tucking this, the edge of this rubber into the groove. If you expose this rubber to carburetor spray or gasoline, it may be swollen. And it's going to be pretty difficult to get in. I dropped the needle in. It drops right down to center. And you can see that slide is all the way down, the metal slide in there. And the spring is holding this little holder doohickey in there. Different carburetors have different arrangements for holding that, that guy down there. And the critical part is compressing this all. And I'm holding it right now and making sure that the gasket didn't slip out of the groove. You know, sometimes I mess up. I put one together and it's like not working. I'll show you how to test it once we get all the screws in. You make sure the spring, the spring will end up getting all screwy in there and like fold up or whatever. It'll kind of get all, it won't collapse nice and evenly in the carburetor. And I'm just doing all this by hand right now. And come back. And these are shoulder bolts, so they just bottom out. The actual metal of the bolt bottoms out. It's not gonna smash this fiberglass reinforced plastic. So first check I'll do is I'll make sure this goes up and drops all the way down freely. That's important that that's functioning just right there. The next test I'll do is if you're dealing with an LX carb, this is your air port. And normally that would make the slide go up, but what you could do is you don't want to put the full pressure on this little port here. See how it goes up? That means it's operating normally and everything's put back in place the way it should be. Little foam doohickey. We got the mixture enrichening doohickey. I'm being pretty sloppy about calling things incorrect names. There's an O-ring in there. We got the spring. So you saw the little pintle or the needle of that that diaphragm goes in first. And I'm going to go ahead and collapse that in there. And I'm holding it with my finger while I get the screws started. And once you get one of them in there, it's kind of enough to hold it down just temporarily. Get the other one down. Again, the only way, I've never seen one of those diaphragms damaged. I mean, if it was exposed to a lot of fuel or carb spray, it would be damaged. Never seen any problems with that. And to be honest with you, I don't even know if it's available as a part because I've never had to replace one or look it up. I don't think it is. Yeah, that's one thing, these carburetors, not too many of the parts are available on that are the funky little parts, you know, on them. So carburetor's all back together. Nothing left behind. If the fuel line was bad, I would have replaced that, but don't need to do that. There's that little cap. Pretty much putting it all back in is the reverse order of pulling out. Wiring to the choke mechanisms all hooked up. You got your fuel line, the 2 coolant lines. Make absolutely sure that those clamps are on the hoses. Any of these hoses are questionable. Obviously, this is now the time to replace it. Unfortunately, I showed you a very clean example of a GT200. Oftentimes, I get a crusty old GT200. It's been parked near the beach for 10 years, has 18,000 miles on it, and somebody didn't give it love for a year or two, and they don't look quite as nice as this. So on the left side of the motor, there's a little metal hoop that holds this vent hose. A lot of times I check my mechanics' work. If they were sloppy and did a carburetor job and did not push that through, fortunately my hand's all in the way here. You know, that little metal clamp just kind of holds the hose. I always like sticking it back in there, kind of the proper routing for that hose. So that's the vent hose. Again, I didn't bother hooking up this the EVAP vent for the carburetor bowl. Like I said, it's not important. Fuel line's hooked up. Throttle cable, always make sure it returns. You know, I've seen times where people get cables hung up in there. This is a perfect opportunity to adjust your throttle free play. There's that little lock nut and the adjuster for the carburetor throttle replay. And you can see that just has a little bit of free play. You know, that's, you know, it's kind of a preference thing, but you always want to have a little bit of free play on that throttle adjustment. I put a squirt of fresh gas in here. It's going to take some cranking to get it going. I'm going to have some screwdrivers ready to make some adjustments to the carburetor if needed. Let's see if my work succeeds. So ignition on, run switch is on. We know it has spark because it kind of attempted to start with the carburetor the way it is. These have a fuel pump, so they'll pressurize the system. And I'm just keeping the throttle closed. Voila, it's idling. So the way they'll work is they'll idle a little high at first, just by a little bit. You want to give it about a minute, and then the auto choke's gonna shut off the cold start enriching passage, and we'll see how the thing's idling once it's warmed up a little bit. So scooter's idling away. It sounds great. I don't see anything leaking on the ground. And of course, before you start a scooter hasn't been started, make sure it's got oil and make sure the coolant level's correct and looks good. I'm going to take this side skirt off. I want to inspect the fuel lines. Like I said, I've already done the fuel lines in this, so I'm just taking this off to show you. There's a long screw in the back, shorter screw in the front. The skirt, like any of the GTs, pulls right off like that. And you can see we've already changed all this stuff. So underneath here, you got a couple things going on. This is your automatic fuel tap. This is a vacuum line that goes to the manifold pressure. No issues here. This is working fine. Sometimes they'll leak right at the seam. You want to drain the tank, pull that out, and replace it. This is your vacuum operated fuel pump right here. You got a fuel inlet and then the fuel outlet. And right here is the manifold vacuum, and is what uses the pulses of the engine, the flap of diaphragm. And sometimes when these pumps stop pumping fluid, if I pulled this fuel off, it would be gushing fuel out, but I'm not going to do that. I know the fuel pump's good on this bike. This is a common hose that ends up leaking, and that's a 1/4 inch piece of hose that was replaced right there. So this is all stuff you want to check along with doing the carburetor. Make sure it's all in tip-top condition before you start riding the scooter. Scooter's been warmed up for over a minute. It sounds pretty good. I don't even think I need to make an adjustment to the idle mixture, idle speed. Like I said, the only thing this thing did is it sat. We had it adjusted perfectly last time I was here, and the fuel varnished up. And you check it out, see how it revs up before you take it on a test ride. Sounds good, comes right back to idle. And I'll just show you just what the 2 screws that you can adjust on the carburetor do, just for the fun of it. So idle speed sounds pretty good. You can see it goes lower. About right there is good. It's warmed up enough where it has a good even idle. Sometimes I have scooters coming in idling like that. That's too high. So that's your idle speed. And on the side of the carburetor, you know, you got, sometimes they're on the left side. On this one, you got on the right side here. or excuse me, the left side, what am I talking about? I'm gonna use the little D-shaped tool on the left side of the carburetor and engage it into that mixture passage. Like I said, I started with 2 1/4 turns. It sounds pretty good. I'm gonna go in a 1/2 turn and you'll listen to the motor. See how it's stumbling a little bit? It's working, the mixture's going lean and the motor's working harder to maintain an idle. I'm gonna back out. There's about a 1/2 turn. So that's a total of 2 1/4 turns. There's 2 1/2 turns. It actually sounds a little bit better. Now a lot of times that screw is adjusted with a gas analyzer. So it's usually right on the cusp of where the motor starts to stumble a little bit on the lean. You know, you can hear the motor just hesitating just a little teeny bit. But 2 1/2 turns, it sounds a little bit better, and that might be ideal for this motor. So you can see it's just a little bit smoother idle. The idle speed just went up ever so slightly. If I went 3 turns out, it might idle a little bit better, but more chance of flooding. The emissions are, it's going to use more fuel at idle, which doesn't really matter, but the hydrocarbons are going to be higher out the tailpipe too. So, but pretty much that's how you do a carburetor on any of the Vespas, you know, whether it's the ET4, LX, GT200. I showed you the most complicated one, which is GT200, which is identical to the carburetor found in the Beverly 200, early Beverly 250s, all that stuff. Check out the description of this file. I'll have all the special tools that we sell and some of the parts that we would use on a typical carburetor overhaul. So.